All right, I think we're ready to get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Banned Books Week webinar, What's the Role of the Higher Ed Community in Supporting Intellectual Freedom? My name is Camille Gamboa, and I'm joining you from Sage Publishing. A little bit of housekeeping to get us started. This event will be recorded. It's being recorded now and will be sent out to all registrants in the coming weeks. The Q&A will be open for all audience members throughout the event, so feel free to submit a question for our panelists at any time, and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. There's also a chat box that's open, so feel free to go in right now and introduce yourselves to others who are on the webinar. I won't see those questions as part of the actual Q&A portion that go into the chat box, so if you have official questions for panelists, put those in the separate Q&A box. Finally, for you tweeters, follow along with us using the hashtag Academic Freedom Webinar. Feel free to ask questions, leave comments, or further engage there. So to start us off, I'd like to quickly, and I mean quickly, overview why Sage, an academic publisher, is organizing this webinar. So we believe that the freedom of expression, the freedom to read, the freedom to learn are key components of a vibrant society. And frankly, the threats to academic freedom that we see today concern us. We want to enable solutions across the country and across the world, and we see librarians and faculty as important advocates for intellectual freedom at all levels. And so, in addition to organizing events like this, we are sponsors of the Downs Award for Intellectual Freedom in partnership with the Library School at the University of Illinois. We are the proud publisher of Index on Censorship magazine, which campaigns for and defends free expression worldwide. You should check it out, indexoncensorship.org. You'll be glad you did. And we are signatories of the Human Rights Campaign and have joined the Unite Against Banned Books campaign of the American Library Association as well to help enlist others in our fight against censorship. You may not know this, you may know this, but Sage is actually an independent company. In fact, our founder recently passed on her shares of the company to an independent trust to guarantee that we will remain independent for the long-term future. This independence means that we are free to focus on our mission and our values for the long term and can create lasting partnerships to combat censorship issues worldwide. And we want to do more in this space. So if you have academic freedom projects that you're working on, events or ideas that you think could use Sage's support, we'd love to hear about them. We have a few blogs and we'd love to write about them. We'd love to spread the word and really be enablers of this great work. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our speakers, Aisha Heikel, Emily Knox, and John Burgess. And I'll pass it on to the three of you to briefly introduce yourselves and your background in academic freedom. Let's start with Aisha, then go to Emily, and then John.
Thank you so much, Camille, and welcome everyone to the session. I'm so happy to be with you this morning. I am Aisha Heikel, and I'm Manager of Archival Service to College of Charleston's AV Research Center for African History and Culture. And I work with students on working with primary sources and instruction. I also work with donors to donate the materials to our repository. And so I work with improving our collection access and disseminating those materials to the public. So I'm going to talk with you all today.
Hi, I'm Emily Knox. I'm an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Most of my research is in information access, intellectual freedom, and censorship. I sometimes touch on academic freedom issues, more thinking about them in terms of scholarly communication and information ethics.
Good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to be with you. I'm John Burgess. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Alabama's School of Library and Information Studies. Like Emily, I'm an information ethicist. I have a passion for intellectual freedom, but I would say my strongest areas are in issues of moral reasoning and sustainability ethics with an emphasis on intergenerational justice. And so I really just care about working as broadly as possible with as many people as possible to help facilitate open communication, the share of ideas, not just for the present day, but for many generations to come. So that's where my passion lies, and I can't wait to talk about this subject with all y'all.
Thank you. As you can see, we've got a stellar panel. So let's dig into the questions. This is going to be largely Q&A based, starting with some questions we prepared, some answers we prepared, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience, as I mentioned before. First question for all of you. How have challenges to academic freedom changed in recent years, and what do you think is causing those changes? For this one, let's start off with Emily.
I think one of the main issues is that there is direct targeting of professors. I'm particularly thinking about the professor watch list, where professors who are generally progressive or even farther to the left are listed and are targeted by individuals. Often this targeting involves trolling, so trolling people's emails, their work emails, or them on Twitter, and also issues of doxing. Sometimes people will actually call the school itself and want to get in touch with somebody. This especially is an issue at many universities and colleges, because whether they are private or public, often the buildings themselves are open. So this can, this is essentially, it can be a threat to your own person. And then another thing I think about is funding disparities. It's sometimes difficult to talk about academic freedom because it's something that you don't necessarily think about until it is challenged in some way. So how am I worried about talking about something? Because I have tenure, I often am not worried about talking about something. I know there are a lot of challenges to tenure right now, but it's very hard to describe to people who don't have it or don't understand how it works. It's what you might call like an ontological change in who you are when you relate to the institution itself. So these are the main challenges that I see. They are reactionary things that happen because someone does not like your work or thinks it's not worthy.
Very interesting. What you say about motives is probably a key component. Thank you. John, what thoughts do you have there?
Yeah, I definitely want to echo everything that Emily said. I think she's spot on. And I would also kind of point out the antithesis as well. It's like Emily spoke a lot about how this is getting very personal, right? How it's coming to your office, your email inbox, your phone. But there's also a degree to which it is becoming increasingly and radically impersonal. The wonderful mechanisms that allow for such easy access to communication through all sorts of social media elevate the most radical positions to the top. The more striking your position, the more attention it gets, and the more you're rewarded for it. And at the same time, with a culture of combativeness, the other person on the other end becomes not a full flesh and blood human being with a full repertoire of wants and desires and vulnerabilities, but they become a target. They become your opponent in the grand sport of winning the culture war. And so it's so easy to both focus, hyper focus group responses on individuals through the form of distributed lists like this, and so easy to see it as not causing immediate harm. It's a victimless crime because that professor on the left or right coast is not really a person. They're Antifa, right? So that's all I would add to what Emily already established.
That's great, and that's probably when the doxing starts, when people don't realize there are human beings at the other end of it. Aisha.
Yes, definitely agree with all my colleagues have mentioned. I think funding on the other side for the libraries is that a lot of the subscriptions for databases and other kind of materials keep going up each year, which, puts a strain on resources. And so I think a lot of times we have to make decisions in our collection buying policies around what are we purchasing, what we're not purchasing. And that really goes to a lot of if it's more mainstream items get clicked on a lot more, right? And so they'll have higher return on investment. And so we put money towards those pieces or those resources, which is great, but there leaves the smaller, smaller disciplines and smaller majors, they get left out. And so it's kind of the balancing act we have to do for our library budgets. I think also in terms of funding, you have legislation. If you're a public institution, a lot of legislation, will threaten to cut funding for if institutions teach A, B, and C. And so a lot of academics, a lot of, that's challenges, people's syllabuses. They can't or not allowed to teach, certain materials on your syllabus because if it gets back to the wrong person, you may be on nightly news, or you may be doxxed, as our colleagues have said, that that fear of getting doxxed, getting trolled can limit your ability to maybe have more controversial topics on your syllabuses, or even buying other materials that are from more radical databases. So a little bit of that. Thank you.
Yeah, great point. So people are maybe preemptively censoring themselves because they're afraid of what the backlash might be. Interesting. This is great in setting the landscape. So moving on to our next question. What role can faculty and librarians play, if any, when they see bans that impact their university and their community? And not just bans, but maybe it's just, not just these official bans, but some of these challenges I think that you just talked about in terms of direct targeting, funding disparities, all of these challenges. What role can, individual professors, can individual librarians play there? Let's start with Aisha. You've got a great librarian perspective, I think. So what would you add there?
Yeah, I think just kind of going off what I was mentioning earlier for the library side. So even if you can't try to promote some of those smaller databases or smaller journals that have that maybe have a little bit less, viewership. So collaborating with faculty in that department that may have the topics in those databases, so that encourage the students to use those materials. Also making, if you have challenges to your policy or to databases, reviewing your collection element policy to make sure you have a workflow and how to deal with a process to dealing with any kind of bans or challenges, and then make sure you follow that when something happens, and then make sure that's public to the public transparency, right? So you want to make sure that nothing is considered, behind the gate, behind the wall. It's all about transparency. I went to another talk here down in Charleston, South Carolina, and they recognized the differences between, quote, a more progressive state or a conservative state, and that tactics in conservative states, you may have to take a softer or more honey than vinegar kind of approach versus kind of the more, aggressive in your face approach. And so it's really recognizing who are your stakeholders and recognizing how is it best to reach those folk about the material. So it's really about not limiting information to people, even if you don't want it yourself. It's about not preventing other folk to get the materials. I think if we talk about those conversations to the public in that lens, then it can have more discussion and honest conversation about these issues. On the faculty side, as assigning, banned books to your students, having assignments that cover these controversial topics, so that students themselves do their own research on these issues and not just regurgitate what's on Twitter, what's on Instagram, and all the other social media platforms. Have students and even yourself attend city council meetings, school board meetings, to make sure that if someone comes up with a book that you are there to to kind of counteract and to provide the other side of the conversation, so that it's not just one side being at those city council meetings. And if something happened on your campus, don't be afraid of actual action. Have a walkout, have a, start a social media campaign, really use all of your resources, your alumni, you should work with your donors. And so really advocate for your students, advocate for yourself. And I'll stop there. Let my colleagues go on. Thank you.
Fantastic, actionable ideas. Thank you. I hope people are taking notes. I certainly am. Great. Emily, do you want to go next if you have thoughts, and then we'll go over to John?
So I think my main thing is to get involved. So one of the things that we often react to something that has already happened, but you actually have to be on the ground level first and say, okay, what can I do to make sure that we are hearing information that is representative of many different points of view? So if you do know that something is happening, for example, in your legislature, are you writing to your own representative? Are you going down to your, sorry, I'm in Illinois, so down is Springfield, to your legislature and seeing what's happening at the various hearings that are going on? We really need to not just be in our own ivory towers. We need to be part of our communities and have different voices heard. This is something I've been emphasizing over and over again. So I really see that as the role of what faculty and librarians should be doing right now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I love the idea of being proactive and horizon scanning and seeing what's coming up next. And the other thing that I would add is, like, this question was kind of framed, and I think, entirely appropriately so, as what we as individuals can do to respond, what are individual responses. But the problem is so huge that if we only respond to it as an individual, this is a kind of a opening a door to perpetual reaction, like Emily was talking about, but also to feeling alienated and hopeless because there's nothing that one person can do to change a circumstance. So both of my colleagues have mentioned getting involved. And I think, honestly, that's the best thing to do. Find like-minded folks who care about not just a particular ideology and expanding the reach and successful outcome of that ideology, but who, like so many people in chat already, care about discourse and care about community building and care about, seeing a place flourish, not just for your side, but for everybody. So get involved. Don't be afraid to talk to people and look ahead and see when those big calamitous waves are coming, see where you need to be to help bring a lot of people in to respond to it.
Great points. Get involved and remember that it's a systemic problem. So it's going to require systemic change. Thank you. Okay, next question. How can librarians and faculty steer students away from misinformation? Because I'm sure they encounter a lot of it all the time. They're bombarded with it without restricting access to information, without being part of the problem when it comes to academic freedom. John, let's go back to you to start us off, and then we'll go to Aisha and Emily.
Yeah, of course, you really hit the nail on the head with that. The last thing that we want to do is make ourselves arbiters of what people ought to believe in any realm. The moment we set ourselves up as the interpreters of not just what is correct but what is good, it's the moment where we take on a responsibility that we can't possibly maintain in all places and all time. So one of the courses that I have the privilege of teaching is is information literacy. And I know, probably all of you in the room already have, a deep familiarity with the ACRL framework and with mechanisms for helping people interrupt their assumption cycle, like the CRAP method and like the SIFT method, and all of those are wonderful and useful. And I think it's really important for us as LAS faculty to make sure people are armed with those understandings of the framework, understanding the ways to be critical in the intake and evaluation. But ultimately, I think what I try to train my students to do is in moments like that, where a person who they're working with is clearly already up to their eyebrows in misinformation or disinformation or malinformation, is to be like funny with them, to be a person, to joke, to use your affective skills, because you're never going to argue that person out of the thing that the entire community that they've saturated themselves into has told them not only is true, but makes them a good person. And obviously we're not talking about just like, small interpretations of fact, but we're talking about, Emily already dropped an ontology bomb on you. I'm going to drop an epistemology bomb on you now. So if they've already steeped their epistemology in the ideology of a given culture, you're not going to argue them out of that. So what you can do is like be a real person in front of them and share with them what you do, and be like, oh, are you sure? Where did you hear that? Can you show me? And basically disarm the situation. Don't be afraid to use humor. Don't be afraid to show the limits of your knowledge, because it's only in moments like that where they're going to be open to actually listening. And if they don't listen, then there's no hope in shaping and shifting that window towards more evidence-based understanding of the world.
Alicia?
Yes, thank you, John. I agree. I think when we talk to people who shifted from, straight racist to, people who are very willing to engage in conversation to a more inclusive society, when you talk to them and even read those memoirs, the switch happens when they talk to people of other races, right? So there's this, so when you are by yourself, you're there with your family, you have like-minded people who don't challenge you, then that is when you get the misinformation, disinformation happening. But when you talk to other people and you engage with them, not just on the topics, but as a person, on a human level, then that will bring people together. And that's when you can bring that information and provide other ways of thought. We're going to talk with students. We do the CRAP test, as John mentioned, and it's really about being a critical evaluator. And we ask students, do you want to be a consumer? Do you want to be a producer? And they often say, I want to be a producer. Well, that is, you don't want to consume everything. You want to be critical. You want to produce information. And so that is kind of what we talk with students about that. And so when we put that in the frame of that, then they often get it and want to engage with materials. And so as an archivist, I work with primary sources. And so bringing out the raw materials of history, the letters, the photographs, it's really hard to say this didn't happen when you have a photo here that says, yes, this did happen. People were here, people were attacked, people were murdered. And so that evidence provides support for the other way of thinking. Also, given what John was saying, the Socratic method, questioning, that, where do you hear that? Who said that? When did it happen? And so when you get people to question themselves and respond to those things, then they get to thinking, okay, maybe this isn't, where can I find other information? I'm not as informed as I thought I was on this topic.
So when I talk about misinformation and disinformation, I really try to emphasize that it's not about facts, it's about the interpretation of those facts, which is actually what Popper discussed, right? It's really not, when you can't steer people away from misinformation, because misinformation is how they are understanding what you are presenting to them. It can be a mistake, but often what people are doing is taking one little aspect of something you've presented and seeing it in a light that doesn't make sense in some way, or that you've never thought about, or something like that. So what I often talk about are vaccine mandates. So people protested that vaccine mandates are about a loss of autonomy and bodily control. This is absolutely true, right? Like there's no way around that. If you're mandating a vaccine, that's not misinformation to say that vaccine mandates say that you have to put something in your body. That's true. You have to address misinformation based on where people are coming from and how they are responding to what you are saying. I think there's just too much focus on like, is this a fact? Is this not a fact? But in some ways, the facts don't matter at all. It's really much more about who am I as a person? How do I understand what's being presented to me? What sort of baggage do I bring to whatever is in front of me? Is this my a gatekeeper that I trust telling me this information? Do I care at all about this? Like there are many, many different issues. And I just worry that we are not addressing this issue holistically. We're looking for quick fixes, but in fact, there aren't any quick fixes for misinformation and disinformation. If you doubt me, I really encourage you to take a look at the Russian disinformation campaign from 2016. It's not what you think it was. It actually addressed many different audiences. For example, they set up things that said that were spoofing Black Lives Matter to decrease the Black turnout to vote. So how would you interpret that? Yes, it's disinformation, but it was resonating with a particular community. How do you interrupt that? You have to say, no matter what someone says to you, you have to vote. But how do you get people to make that next step? So I really think that it's up to especially librarians who are working on media, cultural, emotional literacy to engage the full person when we're talking about these issues.
Great points. As a follow-up to that, some of the points you just made, Emily, and this can be a question for anyone, I think it's important that if you were to do what you just said, that we check our own biases, right? And so like for librarians and faculty members who, like for the example you just mentioned with vaccine hesitancy, if they have a student that says this is absolutely against, your bodily autonomy, this is not right, someone's first instinct might be, well, that's not true because the larger population are going to be impacted in ways that make them not autonomous. But what you were saying before, Emily, was very true, in that like in fact it is also true, right? It can be true. So I think those biases that we bring to the table will might cloud our thinking when we have these points brought to us, and when students come to the table with those ideas and thoughts. So what can professors, instructors, librarians do to keep their own biases in check when those things happen? John, yeah.
So I would slightly reframe the way you characterized it there, just because bias is such a powerful word and has certain connotations. I would I think I'm overly attached to big words, but I would think of it instead as a hermeneutic, as an interpretive lens that is that comes out of a culture that we have already been invested in for decades of our lives. And so, to Emily's point, this is not a tactic. There's not a tactic that's going to solve this. It's if it's going to be solved, then it's going to have to be a strategy. And I think the strategy in some way is going to involve distributing equity, fairness, and justice as broad as possible through our society, because it's in moments of in epochs of desperation where people's normal hermeneutics, ability to interpret the world around them, can so easily become weaponized. Talking, and I know we've got other things to talk about, but like, you're absolutely right, Emily, about Russian disinformation campaigns. And it's not even just the 2016 one, and obviously it's not just Russian either, but the idea of the postmodern autocracy is so fascinating, that so many of our principles, of our values, like access and intellectual freedom, were liberal responses to experiences of unitary tyranny. What happens when a centralized state is able to define for you what the truth is? The answer is to become fully informed, autonomous individuals, and therefore be able to resist the centralized power. A postmodernist autocracy now works to destroy truth, period, so that there can be no foundation for expertise, for evidence, for even personal experience, to do anything but to satisfy one's own conscience. And this destroys the ability to resist power, because there can be no agreement. So I strongly believe that we need to focus on things like equity, justice, fairness, so that we can reduce the urgency of being able to fight for our hermeneutical lens up above and beyond those of everyone else.
Thoughts from others? Anything to add?
So when I teach, I let students know where I'm coming from. And I always let them know that they do not have to agree with me. They do not have to, take on my ideas. They do have to have good arguments, which is different from agreeing with whatever I might be presenting. I feel like that sets up a classroom where students realize that they have to really, know their stuff, be able to say, provide support for what they are saying from, acceptable resources. So it's sort of a way of saying that, it's not always like a peer-reviewed journal is the best standard. It might be something else that they have looked at. But I feel that by offering to students that, yes, I realize that I have my own standpoint, that allows them to know that where I'm coming from, why I might be bringing up certain topics. And I really try not to, I try to use things like rubrics to make sure I'm not penalizing students for not agreeing with me. I try to really be fair and equitable in my grading, because I think this is often where our bias shows in ways that we might not realize.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move on to our last question our last prepared question. And this is a good time to remind everyone that if you have questions for these panelists you'd like to bring up, put them in the Q&A box now. I see there's a very active chat, which is great. It's easier for us to comb through questions for the panelists if you can put them in the separate question and answer box from Zoom. Now for that last question, it's kind of a summary question. Is there anything else, I should say, because you've already mentioned lots of really good things, that faculty and librarians can do to promote a culture of intellectual freedom in an era of extreme polarization? And, because we are a group of librarians and faculty, I'm wondering specifically if there are things that we can do partnering with each other, connecting librarians and faculties to support each other's work. Aisha, if we could start with you, and then we'll go over to Emily and John.
Yeah, to follow up on the kind of about bias, I think when the long history of libraries and archives and museums being seen as neutral and objective and unbiased, the last 20 or so years, a lot of these professions have been a little more open about there are biases in museums and libraries and archives. And so the idea, that positionality shift in the profession has really opened up a broader discussion of freedom, academic freedom, of how our collections are interpreted, how our collections are collected. And so I think that those changes have made the museum, archive, libraries much more relevant in society. They're not seen as these quote unquote ivory tower spaces that are just for certain people, but by opening up and admitting the biases, admitting how materials have come into the repository, then that has encouraged people to come in and see us as a space for them. They're seeing themselves much more in our collections and our programming. Even though I work at a collection that documents Black experiences in South Carolina and Charleston, and we have gaps in our collections given in terms of economic statuses or sexuality. And so we're working to we recognize that, and we're aiming to correct those and working with communities to collect those collections so that our collections are inclusive, beyond just the racial aspect, but are document people from all different perspectives. And so I think that is where librarians and teaching faculty can collaborate, because these are folk that are working with communities. They're studying and researching in these areas, and they have those connections to communities locally. And so they can work with the faculty, work with librarians, work with archivists to bring those materials into the repository, bring those people on campus for lectures, for workshops, and for even creating exhibits in the museums. Also in your instruction, when you're doing the demonstrations for students, is having more inclusive examples, working on the library as a whole is working on improving subject headings, changing them to be more inclusive, changing description and words that are used in catalog and in finding aids. And so all those are ways that we're trying to promote culture of freedom. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I can't remember. Emily, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I think the way you promote a culture of intellectual freedom is actually by asking people questions about where their points of view come from, and not responding to how what they might say in a way that is simply judgmental, I guess, right? That you are open to finding out more. In fact, you have to have a point of view of intellectual freedom yourself, right? To hear what people say. You may or may not agree with it. You may feel like I really need to refute this in some way. So I'd say the way you do that really on our campuses, it's definitely difficult, but what I try to think about is I was on the Freedom of Expression Committee here at the University of Illinois, and what I tried to get put into, like, when you have speakers come, is really think about, it may seem really off base, but the IRB process, because what the IRB process does is force you to think about who might be harmed when you have a speaker come. I couldn't get all the committee members on board with like doing a shortened process for it, but I think that's the most important point, is to really think through who am I addressing? How might they interpret this? How do I present this in a way where they might hear some of what I'm saying? It's sort of really thinking through that the person who's listening is an actual person. We've mentioned that several times. And that how do I express or offer ideas that may or may not, accord with what they think as well. It's more difficult to do than just say whatever you want to say and not care about what someone feels about it. But those are the sorts of things I've been thinking about.
Yeah, I love what you said about finding ways to get involved on within your university's culture. And I think to that point, I would just add, like, if you care a lot about this, if you're the type of person who wants to track down sources and resources and have conversations, and you spend what's likely a beautiful day sitting in a webinar listening to people talk about intellectual freedom, you probably have some degree of knowledge of the subject. And what I would do is encourage you to trust your expertise and be willing to share it with others. Find ways to get onto, if you're in an academic environment, the committees. If there are civic groups, if there are educational groups, my goodness, run for your local school board. Anything that you can do to share your knowledge of the importance of intellectual freedom in a public way, do so, because it's very important for us to keep in the public eye the fact that this is a value worth living for. And the only way that you can really do that is being out there, living your values virtuously, so that others can see. So don't be shy, don't doubt yourself, share your expertise, and be willing to be present, so that others can see this value in action.
So I'd really like to address some of the discussion happening in the chat about bias in science. I think it's really important for us to get to that. I know that's not one of the questions, but I think the idea that somehow science is unbiased does not really hold up. Science is a way of thinking about the world that we occupy, right? But the people who are doing the work of science are people, and their interpretation of that world has its own baggage with it. If science was just something that was unbiased, then we wouldn't see something like the Black maternal mortality rates that we see, right? It's impossible. If you are a human being, you look at the world through your own, as John said, hermeneutic lens. I understand the desire for science not to have a bias, but even if you pick certain examples, those examples are based on something, and you have picked them for some reason. I think it's better to acknowledge that bias and say, how can we improve our examples? How can we show that over time science has done terrible things to people? And I think that needs to be an important part of the conversation, especially if you're teaching something like biology. Like that is a field that has been rife with human trauma. Where did gynecology start? There is, if you don't know, the father of gynecology did all of his experiments on enslaved women without giving them any sort of anesthesia to just essentially destroy their bodies. You can't say that that does not have an effect on how we understand the medical field, biology today. These are decisions that, so I don't know that there are biological facts. When you present a fact to somebody, they are still going to interpret it, right? You can present a fact, but saying that fact does not mean that someone will interpret the fact the same way you do. You are just presenting a fact. And no matter, and then also, what is the language you're using to present that fact? That is also very important. There are many different terms you could use. So I said enslaved people instead of saying slaves, right? That is a way I'm presenting a fact. You can't get away from how language shapes our world, even if you are presenting something like facts. And I think this is just an important point to think about. Yeah, there are two types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Yes, but how are the students in your class interpreting that? Do they understand what a rod is? Do they understand what a cone is? How do they relate to rods and cones? This comes from when they learned biology, but what I'm saying is that they bring their own lens to you saying that fact. And that is what matters. That you have, 150 students listening to you, and they're all bringing their interpretation to what you're saying. So just thinking about, so obviously that is not necessarily the same terminology that you would use in a different classroom, right? You're using rods and cones because that's the terms we use in English. What if your students are speakers, English speakers, and this is their second language? They have to do that interpretation in their head and think about what is a rod, what is a cone. This gets into semiotics and that sort of thing. But I think trying to say to ourselves that we're just presenting facts and not thinking about the interpretation of those facts is why we have so much trouble solving the, I saw someone say, wicked problem of misinformation and disinformation.
Great, very thought-provoking. Thank you, Emily. John, sounds like you're ready to go.
Yeah, I'm ready to go. Science. Science is a majestic instrument for trying to come to understand the world. And the reason why in an open combat against Aristotelian argumentation, it won is not because of its ability to provide more certain certitude, more absolute objectiveness than the system that we had before, because the system of disputation that we had before was fantastic for generating absolutes that had official prescribed interpretations that one, if one wanted to be in line with correct thinking, would adhere to. No, science won in a head-to-head battle because of its modesty, because of its provisionality, because of the fact that it was in every way humble. And so as we're teaching facts, science is a perfect place for us to introduce this idea of the importance of interpretation and the importance of limited understanding, because it's in our observation of the physical world and how our interpretation of those have changed over time. Look at what we thought gravity was up until the very early 20th century. We were more certain of that than anything else, right? But we could observe, we realized through engagement with the natural world that no, our understanding was wrong, right? And so it allowed us to make that evidentially based switch. And if we were only dogmatic in our interpretation of what the facts of gravity are, we would still be thinking in terms of Newtonian attraction. So I think science is a wonderful place for us to turn to think about these questions of truth and these units of interpretation, because good science, when done well, is not a continued quest for proof for an existing truth. It's endless humility about what we currently believe is sufficient evidence, right?
Great, thank you. Great points. Aisha, do you want to chime in on this one, or should we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, just want to think eugenics, was considered fact. And we have definitely debunked and moved away from brain size as a symbol of someone's intelligence. And so I think when we look at freedom and fact and science, it's more that we experience, more that we learn, and the more that we grow in studying these items, we definitely improve as a society, and we become and we become much more that those facts can, or those ideologies, can impact people's day-to-day lives, right? And so that we have moved away from that, and that is great. And so I think we have the freedom to engage those conversations today. So thank you. Sorry.
I just want to say that eugenics was vile, but it was absolutely based on facts of phrenology. So I'm sure many of you seen the various things that measure people's heads, that look at the texture of people's hair. People have different size heads. People have different textures of hair. Those are facts. Well, except it was. They would measure your head and say, this is how I'm interpreting this fact. I think, it's important, if you are teaching or working in science, to think about what might change in the future, right? As we move to issues of quantum mechanics, all of those sorts of things, we will learn more and more about our world, and what we know now might actually be completely wrong. We have no way of knowing what's in the future. So I think this goes to John's issue of having humility when we think about the facts that we are presenting. Those eugenicists thought they were absolutely telling the truth, that they were presenting facts about the world as they knew it. They were wrong. But not only did they present that, they also had incredible social implications for the things that they were saying. The devastation that came because of their ideas. And they would say, well, these are just facts. When you think that way, then you can see that just presenting facts is rarely just one thing. It's really about the interpretation of those facts.
Thank you. That's another great example of the importance of interpretation. And I think we all agree that humility is key, very key. I want to acknowledge some of the things that are being said in the question box. I think anyone can respond to this first question. Are there any journals or sources that systematically research, review, and discuss media literacy and disinformation? Are there any initiatives within any professional societies? I think some people are already putting things in the chat box, but feel free to continue to add there. Then someone else said, has anyone on the panel worked with Braver Angels, 501c3 based in New York? Anyways, maybe that's one for us all as homework to look up and dig into. And then I want to kind of shift gears and go back to kind of the core of this webinar, especially as we're winding down our time. Many of the things and the suggestions that you all have, John, Emily, and Aisha, have been, incredible insights and action-oriented. It's been very action-oriented and very much from, the top down, which makes sense because, we're talking to faculty and librarians. But how can faculty and librarians harness the initiatives that bubble up from students and support and enable those initiatives so that they become, bottom up, for lack of a better term, and getting those students from on the ground to really invest in these academic freedom initiatives. Anybody wants to raise their hands who's ready to take that one? Aisha.
Okay. I think for students, it's really, here at College Charleston, we have LSA, which is Library Student Ambassadors. And so that is a group of students that are committed to improving library access. And so I think if certain libraries should have organizations like that, and then encourage them to be proactive, advocate for the materials, because administration listens to students more than listen to faculty. And so I think using those types of organizations will support any kind of freedom, having students write petitions on behalf of faculty that have been targeted. Really, that is a way to gain support and across campus. Also, like I mentioned, doing walkouts or doing, will also support if any kind of campus challenges. Here at the college, we did a student banned books read-in. And so really promoting literacy, promoting information throughout history, I think would be a way to engage students.
John or Emily, other thoughts on getting students invested?
Well, nothing really beyond exploring opportunities to participate in professional organizations at student rates. It'll never be cheaper than it is right now to become involved in any area and any working group or roundtable that you have a degree of interest in. 80% of life is just being there, and so it's hard to ask anybody to spend money to join an organization, but now is the right time to do it, and it's a good way to seek opportunities with like-minded folks.
So it's kind of a question. Are you seeing your students take an interest? Like, can you in preserving academic intellectual freedom to read? Does it seem to be they care about? It's on their minds, and how do you harness that when you come across it?
Sorry, Emily, go ahead.
So yes, I would say they are, particularly with the books that are being challenged right now. Before this current onslaught of book challenges, I often had lots of discussions about harmful materials and how whether or not libraries should collect those. My hope is that we see from these challenges right now why it is important to support academic and intellectual freedom. That in fact, these are moves about power more than anything else, and that you never know who is going to be in power at any one time. So I think students are quite engaged on these issues. It's just really trying to see how these things play out in places like museums, protests, all sorts of places that the right to freedom of expression is in fact a human right, and thinking about it more broadly than simply, well, I really like this book, so why is someone trying to take it away? But how do we engage with many different ideas, and who is saying what we can engage with, and how are they trying to impose their own ideas on a society?
Thanks. Any further thoughts in the remaining 30 seconds that we have left? Great. Well, this has been fantastic. You all have given us some actionable ideas. You have given us a new way to think, I think, and just inspiration to continue this. And we want to thank everyone for your thoughts too. In the chat box, someone came in and said, can we have an open forum Zoom with breakout rooms to brainstorm solutions? Unfortunately, we don't have time to do that, but what a fantastic idea, and maybe something we'll pick up in the future. Just as a reminder, you will get a link to the recording in the coming weeks. Feel free to pass it around. We'd love for shares of this. And also for those of you librarians and others who are attending the Charleston Library Conference in November, this same group will be continuing the conversation on November 2nd. I think it's the first thing in the morning, the 8:30 a.m. session. So we'd love to have you join in the room as well. And thanks again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.